U.S. Treasury at that time was going to
Okay,
adopt a
I'm going to
bailout
talk
policy.
about the Mexican currency crisis,
People who take
right?
risks,
And the goals here
they
are
should bear
not
those
to
risks
necessarily
and
be
get the
experts
reward
about
for them.
Mexico and its financial history,
They should
but
take the
it's a great
downside.
example that'll help us to understand, one, how do
Okay.
exchange rates work, two, how does a central bank try to defend its currency when it gets in trouble and wants to crash, three, what is the International Monetary Fund and what does it do? So anyway, we'll use Mexico. 1994, they had a crisis. A couple things to note that will help very much, and I'll repeat it in the slides here. One is that if your currency devalues or depreciates a lot rapidly, your country will feel a lot of pain, right? If the peso crashes, loses a lot of value, a lot of bad things happen, to the people in Mexico, right, economically. Anybody who has wealth that's denominated in pesos, one day they might feel very rich and wealthy. The next day, what they hold is not worth as much. Maybe they're bankrupt. That's the same for companies and banks and individuals and governments. What they own is now worth less than it was before, and that can be very very bad. Two, if you owe money to foreigners, right? If the peso crashes, it's going to be more difficult to pay that debt back because your peso has less purchasing power, right? And so companies, individuals, banks, financial centers, governments themselves can go bankrupt essentially, right? And then another thing would be, any company that buys stuff from the world, could be energy, could be supplies, it could be food, right? It's going to be more difficult to buy that stuff. So anyway, people lose their jobs, company goes bankrupt, and we get the crisis that we have. So that's one thing to note, right? Devaluation, depreciation that's rapid is painful. So let's try to avoid it, right? Number two is that most central banks, right, hopefully for their own benefit, will have what we call international reserves. Sometimes I call it ammunition. And maybe it's like in the basement of the central bank. Probably in the olden days it was, but its location doesn't matter. What it is usually every country central bank will have a lot of dollars or pounds or euros or some hard currency ready to go for a bad day like we're about to describe. Kind of like ammunition, they can use it to defend their home currency. Typically dollars, right? Dollar is kind of the number one reserve currency of the world, right? So anyway, let's use that information and then we'll talk about Mexico here.
The very day NAFTA came into effect, the Zapatista rebels launched an uprising in southern Mexico. Shortly after, the leading presidential candidate was assassinated. Worried about stability, foreign investment began to flee. The global economy was about to face a new kind of crisis.
Christmas vacation, I was fishing down the British Virgin Islands, and Larry Summers called me, and he said, there's some problems in Mexico I'd like you to know about. And I thought to myself, that it was nice of Larry to call on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm on vacation, and Mexico today, there'll be some other country tomorrow, and I don't know why this can't wait till I get back. Well, it turned out that this was not just another country, it was a very, very serious matter.
I was at a restaurant, and they came and said, the Secretary of the Treasury is on the line. And I got on the line, and he said, Greenspan and I have a problem. And we believe if we don't move very decisively, that the Mexican peso will implode. If it implodes, the Mexican government will become very unstable. And we believe you could have a wave of 5 to 9 million people walking north to find jobs.
He understood it very quickly. And I remember his saying, this is the first financial crisis of the 21st century.
And I said to him, this is the first real-time worldwide financial crisis of a kind that will become very normal. And so I said instinctively, I'll back you.
It was fascinating because we had Mexico, which we really did think was facing default, and we had enormous political problems accomplishing what we felt we needed to accomplish to support Mexico, to try to prevent this from happening. And we all knew that while we believed the program we were recommending was right, there was some risk it wouldn't work.
So you go in and say to the president, here's a big crisis that could happen. I mean, we can tell you something to do about it. We can't tell you it's going to work. It's very risky. And we know that it's extremely unpopular, but we think you should do it anyway.
Somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes, I listened to all this. I said, wait, this is a no-brainer. We got to do this. If we don't do this, Mexico will certainly fail. Then the borders will be flooded with illegal immigrants who are starving and need food and a job. We'll have an enemy on our southern border, people that will remember when they were down and they were in need, we were not a good neighbor, and we will pay hugely for that. All over the developing world, people who look at us and think that we are smug and rich and unresponsive and don't care about anybody else will have all that confirmed. If we help, at least people will know we tried in a good cause, and it will resonate throughout the developing world.
The bailout worked. Mexico paid back the loan early. For some, the intervention set a dangerous precedent, protecting big investors from risks they had willingly taken.
Remember, the people that got bailed out were foreign holders of Mexican government obligations. In a sense, we were trying to bail out our own citizens, but it signaled to banks and other rich investors that the U.S. Treasury at that time was going to adopt a bailout policy. People who take risks should bear those risks. They got the reward for them. They should take the downside.
Okay, so let's revisit there what happened. So first off, right, if you go back to 1994, right before this crisis, started, the United States and Mexico are neighbors, and they had a very healthy economic relationship, money going in both directions. Money going, of course, in this direction. Americans buy stuff in Mexico. They invest in Mexico. They travel to Mexico. They speculate. They think, I want to own a peso when it goes up. And, money goes to Mexico. People buy pesos, right? At the same time, money goes the other direction. Mexicans travel to the United States. They invest in the United States. They buy American goods and services, and they speculate on the American dollar, right? So you have supply and demand of both currencies. And remember, our rule said that balance of payments, when the credits equal the debits, or the money coming in a country equals the money going out of the country, the exchange rate will be stable. The peso will not go up or down in value. Same with the dollar, right? So that video said that 1994, some things happened that sort of spooked, especially short-term investors, right? Short-term investors are especially vulnerable to this, right? Because short-term investors, they're the people who nowadays you got a smartphone and they have a trigger finger right on their smartphone, and if they get nervous, they can just push a button, sell, 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 get out. Nobody wants to lose money. So some of the things you saw in the video, that why would the investors get spooked? One of them was an assassination attempt, right? A Mexican presidential candidate was assassinated. And you can imagine that, some Americans, probably me, don't know much about Mexican politics. But if I were to see that on CNN or TV or read it in the paper, I'd be kind of spooked, like, whoa, man, geez. I don't know what's going on down there, but I don't want to be owning pesos right now. Sell, 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 get out. I'd like to own dollars, until I figure out what's going on. So that spooked investors. Number two, as you saw there, people's guns and, running around with machine guns and whatnot. It wasn't really a civil war, but it was a provincial civil uprising, violence, and so forth. And again, you can imagine investors around the world don't want to take chances. They don't want to lose their money. So if they see that in the news or CNN or whatnot, they're going to press the button, sell, sell, sell. I don't want to have pesos right now. Number three was a little bit slower moving thing, but nonetheless important, is that 1994 NAFTA was just getting started. You remember what that is from class? The North American Free Trade Agreement. Essentially, it was good news for Mexico and, okay news for the United States, but still, it's new. And anything new is a little bit scary for investors. Why take the risk, huh? Is this going to be good or bad, or is there, unexpected things that are going to happen? So that's another reason to be nervous, right, as an investor. And then finally, on here, at least one of them, right, would be a slower moving thing, but there's kind of a truism in investing, right, especially in borrowing bonds and so forth. Is a sentence I've used in class, and I didn't invent it, but I like it very much. And it's essentially, if anybody ever says this next sentence, it's already too late, right? So that one for here would be, hey, Mexico, you've really borrowed a lot of money. Well, are you sure you're going to be able to pay me back? Right? And as soon as anybody in the markets is saying that, asking that, it's too late. It's musical chairs. Nobody wants to be the last loser with no chair to sit in. Here, nobody wants to be the last loser holding a peso that's worth nothing, right? Or less, right? Everybody wants to sell their pesos before it's too late. And so everybody wants out. So anyway, these things and other things combined were sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, and people got spooked. And short-term capital can move quickly, sell, sell, sell. And so what happens, right, is people don't want pesos, they want dollars. As far as our balance of payments are concerned, right, is that money going into Mexico shrunk. Nobody wants to buy pesos right now, so that, BOP credits for Mexico shrink. And then anybody who has a peso is, a guy playing musical chairs. They want to get rid of it. Sell, sell, sell. I want to go to U.S. I want to own dollars. I want to have a place to, be safe. So, right, you can see on my arrows on here, the balance of payments is out of whack, right? For Mexico, the debits are bigger than the credits. There's more money leaving than coming in. Or shortly, said succinctly, nobody wants a peso. Nobody wants a peso, right? So the peso is going to depreciate. It's going to devalue. And remember what I said at the start is that if that happens quickly, the Mexican economy and millions of people are going to suffer real pain, right, in their economy, unemployment, bankruptcy, you name it. So governments tend to want to avoid this from happening quickly. So what do you do if you want to avoid this? You want to defend the peso. You do not want it to depreciate, at least quickly. So in general terms, here's our choices, right? Two choices. It's essentially do nothing, and then something will happen, or do something, defend the peso, try to make sure it doesn't fall. So I got 4 strategies here, probably the big ones. Maybe they don't make sense right now, but I'll go through them, individually. How do you keep your peso value up? How do you keep the exchange rate, from falling for the peso, right? So here we go. Defend the peso. Some of the big ways to do it, right? Number one, right? Here's starting point again, just the same little chart we had, on the previous graph. Number one, it's very quick, right? It's very, easy to do. It's got some nuances to it, but it's essentially the Central Bank of Mexico will announce, we are raising our interest rate. Boom. Hey, world, deal with that. And why does that help, right? Way of thinking about it is that, people around the world, think of rich people especially, but institutions, banks, retirement funds and pension funds, people, big money, they're always looking for the place, where should I put my money where it's safe and it'll grow? I want my money to grow. That's everybody around the world says that. And so one measure for them is the interest rate, right? If I put my money in the bank here at Capital One, nowadays they'll pay me 3% or 4% interest, something that's not very great. What if Mexico comes along here and says, hey, Mike Berry, or hey, world investors, we'll pay you 35%, we'll pay you 60% interest if you put your money here in our Mexican banks, right? So essentially that's a way to prevent people from leaving, right? People are nervous in our little story here about owning pesos. I don't want to be in Mexico with my money. But what if Mexico says, hey, we know you're nervous, but what if we pay you big interest to stay in our Mexican banks? Maybe it won't convince everybody, but maybe it'll convince enough people. Raise your interest rates and the money will come back, right? And some money will stay. As far as the balance of payments go, our arrows here are out of whack. For Mexico, the credits are small, the debits are big. How do you increase the credits? Raise your interest rate, and then a couple things will happen is some Americans, right, will say, hey, I want to invest in Mexico now. I'd love to, earn 35% interest, or right, none of the stupid 3% at Capital One, and the money will come back, right? Other money won't leave because they'll stay. Hey, we also like this interest, right? So now, what do you got there? As I've now evened out the debits and credits, and that's the point at which, right, if their debits equal credits, the money coming equals the money going, the demand of the peso is equal to the supply of the peso, that the currency, you've defended the exchange rate, it will not depreciate. So there you go. That's one solution. Now, before I move on to, second defense is you can't do this forever, can you? Raise your interest rate. You can bring the foreigners back with, 60% interest rate, but perhaps you can think of damage. Who's not going to like a really high, 60% interest rate or something, right? Think of people inside Mexico, right? Analogy is perhaps think of yourself. Maybe you've borrowed money to go to college, or you borrow money to buy a car or buy a house or open a business, or Mount St. Mary's borrows money to build a new dormitory, right? Borrowing, if it's expensive, nobody does it, right? And so what raising your interest rate can do is scare off inside Mexico domestic borrowing. People won't borrow. They won't buy a new car or a new refrigerator. They won't buy a new house. They won't open a new business, right? And the economy will shrink and people lose their jobs this way. So it's kind of a conundrum or a dilemma, right? On the one hand, you want to keep the foreigners from leaving, right? Because that'll be bad if they do. You want to raise your interest rate. But on the other hand, domestically, you can't have a super high interest rate or you'll kill your domestic economy. So anyway, solution, but it has its limits, right? So let's go to number 2, second defense. So back to the start, in other words, forget the interest rate for now, and back to our problem is that for those 4 and other reasons, people are scared of the peso. I want out. I don't want to be the last loser holding a peso that's worthless. Nobody wants a peso, right? So what can you do? The next defense, we did this a little bit in class when we were talking about how does a central bank fix their exchange rate or their currency. It's essentially is buy pesos, right? So look at the picture. What's the essential problem? I exaggerate, but I say nobody wants a peso. Well, anyway, the central bank will come in and say, hey, we got money. If nobody wants the peso, we'll buy them. We want pesos. They'll create the demand. They'll buy pesos off of the open market, right? And they can do this, and that works, right? Buy your own currency. Now, a couple things to note on here, right? First off is, sort of balance of payments issue is what do? Here's the Mexican central bank. The credits into Mexico are less than the debits. Well, they can even it out by pumping hard currency into the economy, right? They buy the pesos, right? Now, slow it down a bit. What's going on? This, remember, before I started any of this, at the very start, one of the 2 things I wanted to remind you is every central bank, hopefully, will have a big pile of, I called it ammunition. They have a big pile of international reserves, perhaps in their basement or on deposit close by. They'll have a bunch of dollars, right? They'll have the money ready to go for this very purpose. If the world doesn't want our currency, if the world doesn't want pesos, hey, we're the central bank. We got big money in our basement. We got dollars. We'll buy the peso. And that demand, right, will be the demand, right, that equals the big supply, and it'll push up the peso. So use your reserves, right? Use your dollars in the basement to buy your home currency, right? And that will keep it from devaluing. All right. So just like the previous one, that works, but you perhaps can figure out what's the limit to doing this. You can't do this forever either, right? And the limit would be, think of that, quote unquote ammunition. What do you do when you run out? There's only so much, in their basement, or and nowadays physically it doesn't have to be there, but when you run out of reserves, run out of dollars or hard currency, you can't. You don't. What do you pay? How do you buy those peso? You can't do it. So the limit is when you run out of dollars or hard currency. You run out of reserves, right? And this is actually the point, at which hedge funds or currency traders or anybody really around the world will really start to pounce on your country. They will see, right, if you're being honest, uh, how much reserves your central bank has. Today, I think in class or whatever, it's, China's had up to $3 trillion of reserves, just a ton of ammunition. They've never been in danger. But some of these countries, they get down close to zero. And when anybody around the world sees that your central bank doesn't have any reserves, it's like they see you're a soldier with no bullets. They see that you're vulnerable. And so, what do you do when you're pessimistic about a currency? What do you do when you're pessimistic about any asset? Right? You short it. You sell it on the forward market. Short pesos or sell pesos forward. Sell pesos on the forward foreign exchange market, right? Those are all the same sentence, right? So people bet against the peso, and all that'll do is speed up the process. It'll make the peso fall even quicker, right? So anyway, what do we got on this? This is our second defense. Use your ammo, use your reserves to buy the unwanted peso, keep up the price. You can't do that forever because you run out of ammo, right? You run out of reserves. So number two. So go to number three here. Number three, right, is similar to what we just talked about. It's essentially, these are my words, not in the book, but get more ammo. Where do you get more reserves? And this is where the IMF comes in, right? The International Monetary Fund. It's the sort of the global bank of central banks, right? Government, central banks get in trouble themselves. And where do they go? They can go borrow at the IMF. So the IMF, they have an office in DC and different countries, sort of the headquarters is in Geneva. And essentially, right, I got a picture sort of to represent the flows. Here's a central bank, the International Monetary Fund. Here's the Mexican Central Bank. And we're now sort of at the position where they have no more ammunition. They have no more international reserves with which to buy their own currency. So what if the IMF says, hey, we'll loan you a bunch of hard currency. We'll give you more ammunition. We'll give you more international reserves. And then with that, they can keep doing what they did on the previous slide. They can buy their own peso, right? Nobody wants the peso. So, hey, we're the central bank. We'll buy the peso. We'll pay for it with these with these dollars, right? So digest that for a second. That'll work. That'll work. There's all sorts of interesting things to think about here. Number one is that the IMF works in this kind of package in what they call tranches, kind of rounds of aid. The first tranche or the first round is automatic. They won't say no. Mexico comes first time, they'll say, sure, here's the first tranche, first round of money. Here you go, Mexico. The reason for that is, of course, is that it's Mexico's money. The IMF is a fund where every member country will put a bunch of money on deposit at the IMF, right? And it'll be a big load of money. And, it's just, the IMF controls. The hope is that it'll never happen that all member countries will have a crisis at the same time. Only one or two at a time will have a problem. And so it's up there, right? Well, anyway, Mexico gets in a problem like we've been describing. They just go to the IMF and says, hey, hey, IMF, give me my money. It's just like me when I keep money at Capital One. I can go to Capital One any day of the week, and say, hey, Capital One, give me my money. It's mine. So they'll give it to them. And maybe that's enough. First tranche. But, of course, sometimes it's not enough, right? And they have to go to the second tranche or perhaps the third tranche. Keep going with it, right? Then it's not so automatic. The IMF is a bank, right? It's not a charity. And so as a bank, it wants to be paid back, right? It wants to make sure Mexico is going to pay them back. And it really wants to, make sure that Mexico is not going to have this problem again in 2 or 3 years and be just begging for more money, in the future. So once you get to the second tranche, the IMF, they might say yes, what they'll do is they'll have these austerity measures that can put conditions on Mexico. They'll say, okay, Mexico, we'll loan you the money. You're going to have to pay it back. But also, you got to, sort of shape up. You're running out of money. You got to do things that'll help you, always have enough money sort of in the future. And so what are those things? For the Mexican economy, it's painful things. Like, hey, Mexico, you got to fire a lot of government workers. They're expensive. You got to have a smaller military. You got to stop building so many nice roads and hospitals and schools and doing nice things for your people. You got to stop having such generous pensions for your soldiers and elderly people. You got to have stop spending so much on a nice healthcare system. You also, on the flip side, you got to raise taxes. Tell your citizens they got to pay up. You got to stop borrowing Mexico, right? Anyway, that's possible. And the IMF, if they see that happening, they'll say, here you go, second tranche, third tranche. But the limit, of course, right? What do you think? It's kind of political. It's all those things I just listed off for Mexican citizens and voters and politicians. Those are all painful. It's hard to tell voters like, hey, man, right at this point where you're suffering and unemployed, we're going to raise your taxes and we're going to stop, helping you with pensions and all that stuff. So the people of a country will have a limit as to how much of these painful austerity measures they'll be, put up. And you might see, I think, in a video I've shown or have available to you on Canvas, where, this kind of package got to South Korea, and there's a man standing there with a big, protesters. He's got a sign. It's got all the Korean letters on it, but it's also got English IMF, and then below that he wrote, "I am fired." And really, that kind of sums it up a little bit. It's just like, thanks a lot, IMF. You're helping our country, but meanwhile, you made me unemployed. It's a real balance, So anyway, what do we do there is number 3. This is your third defense: how to keep the peso up, from depreciating. Get more ammunition from the IMF, but again, it's not limitless. You can't do this forever. Among other things, politically, your citizens probably won't put up with that much, painful austerity measures. I guess there's a couple other things to mention, but let's get to the fourth defense, kind of the last one. You'll find it very similar to the IMF one. It doesn't always work, but a country like Mexico, they're a little bit fortunate in a way that their northern neighbor, the United States, is, one of the wealthiest countries on the planet. And you can go to your neighbor and say, hey, neighbor, will you give us more ammunition, or will you loan us more money? And that's what happened in the video, right? The Mexican government went to the American government and asked for a loan, and Congress, the president, Clinton, you saw him talking about the benefits of doing it or versus not doing it. They did. They offered a loan to the Mexican central bank. At the time, it was, a record $50 billion and there you go. Now, central bank has more, I keep calling it ammunition, but more reserves, has money to buy the unwanted peso, right, and create credits into the BOP for Mexico, right? And so this works, right? It's just instead of borrowing from the IMF, borrow from the American government. Perhaps, other countries borrow from the EU government, maybe Japan or maybe from United Kingdom, or, you can imagine probably a more wealthy country is more apt to do this. US said yes, so it happened. A couple things to note is that Mexico paid the money back, and in fact, they paid interest, so you could say the American government made a profit on this whole arrangement. But there are some limits here too, right? Could you do this forever? Well, number one limit is the U.S. could say no. That's what they did when a couple of years after this, Thailand asked for a bailout like this, and the United States government said no, right? So it's not always a yes, right, when you're from your neighbor. But another, and probably the same limit is just political will. In this case, perhaps inside the United States, because what do you got on this screen right now, right? You've got American taxpayers, right, paying money. I work all year, I pay my taxes, and then I see on TV that my government is sending our money down to Mexico or sending it to Thailand or sending it elsewhere. Voters, taxpayers, they don't typically like the word bailout, right? Oftentimes they really hate the word bailout. Like, why is my hard-earned money going to those guys? That sort of attitude. And so it was, kind of controversial. In this case, they did it, and it worked out, and they paid it back. Now, before we finish here, a couple other interesting things are happening, right? They're kind of true for when the IMF helps, or when the U.S. government helps, or whatnot. One of them is sort of psychological. The video, right? It said that the U.S. government gave $50 billion. They promised, "Hey, Mexico, we got your back. We're ready to loan you $50 billion." They give them this credit line, right? And oftentimes, what can happen is that Mexico will accept that, but they won't actually ever touch that 50 billion, or maybe they only touch half of it, right? And it's kind of a psychological effect. Maybe you can figure out is that the mere kind of words coming out of the president of the United States, his mouth, or the United States government, only the words themselves, that might be enough to fix the whole problem without ever touching that money, right? Because what do we got? Our whole story on here started with sort of short-term investors who are panicked. They're nervous. They're playing, they see bad things happen and they're thinking, musical chairs, I don't want to be the last loser holding a worthless peso. I want out. Well, when they see on TV, that the most powerful man in the country, in the world, or the big wealthy government, the United States, is basically saying, Mexico, don't worry, we got your back. That can ease panic and ease fears. Panicky investors might be like, oh, yeah, things will be okay. The US government's behind us. And that might be enough so that investors stay in Mexico, and maybe even others are attracted because, by this time, the interest rates in Mexican banks are much higher. And so everybody likes a high interest rate. So that's one thing to note, right? Is the psychological effect of a bailout. Right. Second thing on here I briefly mentioned, but it's a big debate, is the moral hazard of this of any kind of bailout. Moral hazard, right? Moral hazard, right? A simple one is that, is why do you have to pay for your car insurance a deductible, right? I mean, if you get in a big crash, the car insurance company won't pay you everything. They'll make you pay the first 500, first 1,000 or something. They want you to feel some pain. Not because they hate you, right? But they figure that if you know that, you have skin in the game, that you'll drive more carefully, right? That's the exact same thing that the IMF and, loaner, they want countries to know. The IMF worries that if we are always, always, always there to help you, Mexico, that you're going to be like a driver who drives like a crazy man. You're not going to drive safe because you're going to feel like, hey, if things don't go bad, we're good. If we do terrible and the country gets screwed up, the US government and the IMF are there to help us. So who cares? Don't change anything we do. Everything will always be fine. And that's moral hazard. The IMF does not want that. They want Mexico to feel sort of skin in the game, feel some pain or feel some incentive, right, to fix their fiscal and monetary policies and have a more responsible, macro environment, right? But anyway, that's probably beyond our book. What have we learned on there, right? We used Mexico, we used the peso, not because I'm so interested in the peso, but it's just a clear illustration of how financial markets, exchange markets work, what a country can do to keep their currency from depreciating or devaluation. And then also, what is the role of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF? One of their roles here is, as a backstop for liquidity crises like this. But crises like this come all shapes and sizes, many, many countries, and we'll leave it at that. So very good.